A Chinese fighter jet is attempting something unbelievable. It's trying to land on the deck of a U.S. aircraft carrier. Alarms blare, the crew scrambles, and the world holds its breath. Given the current tensions between the U.S. and China, this scenario isn't as far-fetched as it may seem. It could even be a deliberate tactic by China to test U.S. resolve. But what would happen in such a situation? How would the U.S. respond? And what would be the far-reaching consequences of such a brazen act? While the idea of a Chinese fighter jet attempting to land on a U.S. carrier might seem impossible, it's within the realm of possibility. This could be driven by a pilot's decision to defect, a navigational error, or even a deliberate provocation aimed at testing U.S. response capabilities. In the event of such an incident, the crew aboard the carrier would spring into action. Fighter jets would be scrambled, and communication attempts would be made, all while the world watches, anticipating the next move. When the Chinese fighter jet is first detected approaching the U.S. aircraft carrier, the ship's air traffic controllers would immediately try to establish contact. The pilot would be instructed to identify themselves and state their intentions. But if the aircraft remains silent or continues its approach, the situation would escalate rapidly. The carrier's command center would initiate emergency protocols, activating its defense systems. Fighter jets from the ship's combat air patrol would be scrambled immediately to intercept the intruder. Their mission: to escort the Chinese fighter away from the carrier while preventing any escalation. At the same time, the carrier's radar systems would lock onto the aircraft, tracking every movement in real time. Alarms would be sent to nearby U.S. naval forces and shore-based command centers, alerting all assets to the developing situation. As tension grows with each passing second, the crew aboard the carrier would be fully prepared to act. If the Chinese fighter ignores further attempts to communicate and continues its approach, the U.S. Navy would be forced to make a critical decision. The pressure to respond decisively, yet avoid provoking a larger conflict, would weigh heavily on the command. The situation would quickly turn into a high-stakes game of brinkmanship, with every move having far-reaching consequences. A single miscalculation could lead to a diplomatic crisis, or worse, a military confrontation. The carrier crew would be highly trained for such scenarios, but the risks are immense. They would need to decide how far should they go to stop the Chinese fighter from landing. This moment could test the U.S.'s resolve and its response capabilities under intense pressure. As the aircraft closes in, the broader geopolitical stakes come into sharp focus. Every decision made now could affect not just the immediate situation, but also military postures and alliances across the Asia-Pacific region. What do you think the best course of action would be? Should the U.S. take a hardline stance or attempt to de-escalate the situation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Historical precedents and comparisons. While the idea of a Chinese fighter jet attempting to land on a U.S. aircraft carrier might seem unprecedented, history offers valuable lessons from similar incidents. In 1988, a Soviet Mi-8 helicopter landed unexpectedly on the USS Yorktown, a U.S. Navy ship conducting operations in the Black Sea during a period of Cold War tensions. Initially seen as a potential provocation, it was later explained as a navigational error. Nevertheless, both superpowers moved quickly to manage the diplomatic fallout, with communication playing a key role in de-escalating the situation before it could spiral out of control. This incident demonstrated how fragile the balance between military action and diplomacy can be. Even small misunderstandings between rival powers can ignite major crises. Swift and effective communication was critical to preventing escalation during this Cold War encounter. A more recent comparison is the 2001 Hainan Island incident, where a U.S. EP-3 surveillance plane collided with a Chinese J-8 fighter jet over the South China Sea. The damaged U.S. plane was forced to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island, leading to an 11-day diplomatic standoff. U.S. personnel were detained by Chinese authorities, and the incident placed a significant strain on U.S.-China relations. It demonstrated how quickly operations in contested regions can escalate into international crises, especially when military assets are involved. These historical incidents remind us of how easily miscalculations and misunderstandings can lead to far-reaching consequences. Though diplomacy ultimately resolved both situations, they serve as stark warnings about how quickly things can spiral out of control. In today's even more complex geopolitical climate, an unauthorized landing attempt by a Chinese fighter could lead to a far more dangerous outcome. With the US and China both asserting influence across the Asia-Pacific, any such incident could have ramifications that extend far beyond the immediate players, impacting regional stability and global security. The unauthorized landing of a Chinese fighter jet on a US aircraft carrier would set off an immediate diplomatic firestorm. The US government would demand a swift explanation from Beijing, pressing for clarification on whether the pilot's actions were deliberate or a navigational error. Even if China framed the incident as a mistake, tensions would undoubtedly rise. Given the fragile state of US-China relations, any incident involving military assets would add further strain to an already volatile situation. If Beijing hesitates or deflects responsibility, the US would likely respond by reinforcing its military presence in the region, which could be perceived as a provocation by China. Diplomatic channels would need to be activated quickly to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. However, with mutual distrust already in place, even high-level talks would face significant challenges. Both nations would be under immense pressure to avoid appearing weak, while also managing the potential for miscalculation. US allies in the Asia-Pacific would be closely monitoring the situation. These nations rely heavily on the US military presence to deter China's growing influence in the region. A major incident between Washington and Beijing could force them to take sides, further complicating their diplomatic and economic relationships with both powers. Some might support a hardline US stance, while others may push for de-escalation, especially those with strong economic ties to China. Beyond the immediate region, the diplomatic ripple effect would likely be felt globally. Powers like the European Union and India, which have strategic interests in maintaining regional stability, would pay close attention. Even Russia, with its complex relationship with both the US and China, could factor into the diplomatic calculus. In such a charged environment, even the smallest misstep could result in far-reaching consequences, not just for the US and China, but for the entire world. The role of international law and norms. The unauthorized landing of a Chinese fighter jet on a US aircraft carrier would bring international law into sharp focus. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, is the key framework governing military activities in international waters. Under UNCLOS, warships and military aircraft enjoy freedom of navigation and overflight in these areas, but they are also obligated to respect the rights and safety of other nations' vessels and aircraft. In this case, China's attempt to land a military jet on a US carrier without permission would likely be viewed as a violation of these principles. Such an act could be interpreted as both a breach of US sovereignty and a failure to adhere to internationally accepted norms of military conduct. The US would have strong grounds to assert that China had not only violated UNCLOS, but it also acted provocatively, further heightening tensions. More broadly, this incident would fit into a larger pattern of China challenging international law in its quest to assert dominance in the Asia-Pacific. The US would likely use this breach to rally support from its allies and strengthen its legal and diplomatic stance. In situations like these, international law becomes a tool for influence as much as a framework for resolution. Every move by the US and China would be carefully watched by the international community, with the potential for far-reaching diplomatic and strategic consequences. The most significant concern raised by a Chinese fighter jet landing on a US aircraft carrier is the potential for escalation and conflict. Even if the immediate incident is managed without military confrontation, the lingering tensions and mistrust could set the stage for future crises. In the aftermath, both the US and China would likely engage in intense diplomatic activity, each seeking to shape the narrative and rally support from their respective allies. The US would almost certainly demand an official apology from China, along with assurances that such an incident wouldn't happen again. Meanwhile, China might try to downplay the significance of the event, or even claim that the US provoked the confrontation. If these early diplomatic efforts fail to resolve the underlying tensions, the risk of further escalation becomes very real. The US could feel compelled to demonstrate its resolve by increasing its military presence in the region or conducting more aggressive freedom of navigation operations. However, any miscalculation or overreaction by either side could quickly spiral out of control, drawing in other nations and destabilizing the entire region. The role of intelligence and surveillance. In an incident like this, intelligence and surveillance play a crucial role. Both the US and China have sophisticated intelligence networks and advanced surveillance systems in place to monitor each other's military activities. Satellites, drones, and reconnaissance aircraft would be used to track the movements of key assets, like aircraft carriers and fighter jets. Before the Chinese fighter jet even approached the US carrier, intelligence analysts on both sides would be assessing the situation, interpreting the intentions behind each move. Real-time data from radar and other surveillance tools would provide vital information to decision-makers, shaping how they respond to the unfolding situation. For the US, understanding China's military posture and readiness would be key to determining whether the landing was an accident or a deliberate provocation. Similarly, China would be closely monitoring US military movements, looking for any signs of escalation. In this high-stakes environment, intelligence would guide decisions, helping both nations avoid miscalculations that could lead to a larger conflict. Surveillance would not just inform immediate decisions, but would also shape the longer-term strategic moves of both nations. Importance of training and readiness. The ability of the US Navy to respond effectively to unexpected situations, like the unauthorized landing attempt of a Chinese fighter jet, relies heavily on rigorous training and readiness. US Navy personnel undergo extensive preparation, with drills designed to simulate high-stakes scenarios, from intercepting hostile aircraft to defending against surprise attacks. Flight deck crews, air traffic controllers, and fighter pilots regularly practice emergency protocols, ensuring seamless coordination when real crises arise. In a situation like this, every second counts, and the crew's ability to assess and respond quickly can make the difference between de-escalation and conflict. Regular joint training exercises with allied forces also contribute to the Navy's readiness, ensuring that US forces are prepared to operate in any environment. The Navy's commitment to constant readiness means that, when faced with a sudden challenge, the crew is equipped to handle it with precision and discipline. This level of preparedness is crucial in maintaining stability and preventing misunderstandings from escalating into conflict. As tensions between the US and China continue to rise, incidents like an unauthorized landing attempt highlight the need for robust confidence-building measures. Such an event would not only strain the already fragile relationship between the two nations, but also have far-reaching implications for regional security and global stability. In the aftermath, both the US and China would need to carefully navigate diplomatic channels to prevent future incidents from escalating into broader conflicts. This situation underscores the importance of clear communication and established protocols between military forces operating in close proximity. Confidence-building measures, such as increased transparency during military exercises or the creation of emergency communication channels, could help reduce the risk of miscalculation. Both nations have a shared interest in avoiding open conflict, and long-term strategies must focus on maintaining regional stability while managing their competition for influence. As the world becomes more multipolar, the ability of the US and China to manage their differences peacefully will have profound implications for global peace and security. If you found this analysis insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more in-depth explorations of the evolving dynamics between global powers.